Hello everyone, my name is Anna and I welcome you all back to another English video here in our channel of Jóvenes Peregrinando. In today's video, we are going to continue with our studies of the Brit Hadashah, specifically focusing in chapter 9 from the Good News of Mark. And for this chapter, the title is The First in the Kingdom Believe and Serve as Living Stones. But before we begin to analyze today's chapter, let's recapitulate what we have studied in the previous video, which was based in chapters 7 and 8 from the Gospel or the Good News of Mark. And the title for that study was Seeing with Faith the Things of Elohim and Guarding Against the Leaven of Men, where basically in chapter 7 we saw this whole situation about the tradition of washing of hands that the religious people would do, and how Yeshua clarified that this tradition was not a commandment that was given by the Eternal, and that could be found in the Torah, since Yeshua clarifies that this tradition is of men. It was a law imposed by the religious leaders, and therefore it is something that the believers should not fulfill. And we also saw how Yeshua says, or he clarifies and he teaches that he teaches what defiles a person, where basically we saw and we learned that Yeshua said that a person does not become impure by what they eat or by what they touch, but mostly by what comes out of that person, such as the sins that the person may do, or the bad thoughts that they might have, or any type of bad fruits that that person gives. That is what defiles, or that is what makes the person impure. As well, we saw within chapter 7 about the faith of the Syrophoenician woman, where we can read that she did not give up. She did not give up on her faith, because she believed that the Messiah was the only one that could heal her daughter from the unclean spirit that she had, and that she insisted in receiving this miracle for her daughter. And we can also read how Yeshua recognizes this woman's faith, and how it was something rare, because she was a woman from the nations, and therefore she was not raised with the Torah, with the Eternal's instruction. But yet we can read how she had that faith in the Messiah and believed in the Messiah, and therefore she received the miracle for her daughter. As well, we also saw the healing of a deaf man that was brought to Yeshua in the region of Decapolis, where Yeshua once again did a miracle for this man. And in chapter 8, we also saw the feeding of the 4,000 people that Yeshua did, where basically we saw with more detail that all the elements that took place, all the elements that were involved in this miracle that Yeshua did of the feeding of the 4,000, they all have its significations. So if anyone is interested in knowing what these elements, what is the significance of these elements, then you guys can go back to the previous video and listen to what was said in the study of those verses. As well, we also saw that in chapter 8, we also saw that the Pharisees demand Yeshua to give them a sign, that basically saying a sign for Yeshua to clarify that, or assure that Yeshua was the Messiah. But we read that Yeshua said that even if he does give signs, even if he does give a sign that he is the Messiah, the Pharisees were not going to accept it because of their hardened hearts, and because they were also blinded by their religious traditions and laws and beliefs. So that's basically what we saw in chapter 8. As well, we saw that Yeshua tells his disciples to be aware of the leaven of the Pharisees, and this was something that the disciples had to consider. They had to keep in mind of this leaven that the Pharisees had, and which was contaminating the rest of the people. As well, we also continued seeing miracles that Yeshua did towards a blind man in Bethsaida, as well as we can also, lastly, in chapter 8, we read that Yeshua announces about or mentions his death and resurrection, everything that had to happen with the Messiah, and how the disciples didn't understand what Yeshua was saying. But we saw how later on in the letters of for the nations that the apostles and disciples did, they ended up understanding the role of the Messiah and how he fulfilled with it. And basically, within these two chapters, 7 and 8, we received a teaching from the Messiah, which is that we must learn to deny ourselves, take the reproach from the world, and follow Yeshua regardless of anything or anyone else. And in this way, it is how we are going to save our souls and do just as the title for the previous video, which was seeing with faith the things of Elohim and guarding against the leaven of men. And well, that is what we saw in the last two chapters. In today's video, we will first be reading about the transfiguration of the Messiah, a topic that we have already analyzed, we have already studied within the Good News of Matthew, chapter 17 to 18. So therefore, today we are only going to be giving a small summary, or basically we're going to be focusing in the main message of this event. But if any of you guys are interested in knowing more about what had occurred in this transfiguration, or have more details about this specific topic, then you guys can go to the study of Matthew chapter 17 to 18 that we have here in our playlist of studies of the Brit Hadashah. Also, we're going to be seeing in chapter 9, in today's chapter, we're also going to be reading about a liberation from an unclean spirit, how Yeshua mentions again about his death and resurrection. We're also going to be seeing a question that Yeshua's disciples asked among themselves about who is the greatest between them. We will also be reading a teaching that Yeshua gives about practicing sympathy and helping others. As well, we're also going to be reading about the warning that Yeshua gives to those who cause believers to stumble, which we're going to be reading how Yeshua says that those people are going to receive a severe judgment. And well, with this short introduction for today's chapter, we're going to now start with verses 12 to 13 of chapter 9, which says, after 6 days, Yeshua took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. Verse 3, his clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Yeshua. Peter said to Yeshua, Rabbi, is it good for us to be here? Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. Verse 6, he did not know what to say, they were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, saying, this is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. Verse 8, suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Yeshua. Verse 9, as they were coming down the mountain, Yeshua gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. Verse 11, and they asked him, why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Yeshua replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why then is it written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected? Verse 13, but I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him. And just as we finish reading these verses, we can or actually within these verses, we can read about the transfiguration of the Messiah. Here we can read two important things. The first is that Yeshua tells his disciples that there would be some people who would not die until they see the kingdom of Elohim come with power. Let's remember, and something that we have studied throughout these two good news, Matthew and Mark, is that the kingdom of Elohim, it is not referring to something physical, but rather the kingdom of Elohim refers to an establishment in the lives of those who believe in the Messiah. And this is something that was confirmed with the death and resurrection of Yeshua. In this case, we can read that Yeshua was referring to the fact that they would see him as who he really is, that is, with his heavenly nature, and not as his physique, like in person, like how they will look at him on a daily basis, but rather they were going to look at him in his heavenly nature before he was delivered, or in other words, before he was going to offer himself as that perfect sacrifice. And this is precisely what happened within these verses, or in this moment during this transfiguration of the Messiah, which was presented before Peter, James, and John. And in this, it was a way for Yeshua to show himself as the Son of Elohim, something that was going to confirm everything that Yeshua was doing, the miracles, the teachings, the parables, etc. It was going to confirm that Yeshua was the true Son of Elohim, that he was the one sent by the Eternal. On the other hand, we can also read that these verses narrate that the face of the Messiah shone like the sun. In other words, it was really, really bright, and that his clothes became very white. This is a clear sign of the majesty and splendor that Yeshua possesses in the kingdom of the Father. In this place where this transfiguration of the Messiah had occurred, it was a spiritual environment, because we can read that in these verses that Elijah and Moses were presented. Two men who walked with integrity before the Eternal. And something that we can read within the scriptures is that, for example, Elijah, he was the man who did not see death. And Moses was the man who was buried by the Eternal himself. In the scriptures, we can read that these two men walked with integrity before the Eternal. They were obedient to man. They were considered just men, or righteous men. And therefore, or for this reason, it is why these two men, Elijah and Moses, were presented in this place where Yeshua's three disciples and Yeshua himself were. Again, in these verses, we can also read that Peter acts, or he reacts in a human way, because instead of understanding what he was seeing, everything that was happening, which was not something normal, it was something that caused his disciples to be in shock, and they just couldn't believe what was happening. He asks Yeshua if he should make some tents for him, Moses, and Elijah, thinking that these three people were going to be, or in other words, thinking that Moses and Elijah were going to stay in the world for a moment. But we can read that immediately the Eternal spoke to his disciples from a cloud of light, confirming that Yeshua is his beloved Son and that they should listen to everything that he was going to say. What we can read in these verses serves as an example that the Messiah was the prophet of whom Moses wrote in the Torah, and that the time of the Yeshua's coming had already occurred, where the kingdom of heaven was now near for all of these people who wanted to return to the Father through the Messiah. Nowadays, as believers, that we read everything, not only the good news of the Messiah, but we can also read the scriptures, that we read the scriptures, we continue to have the same calling from the Father. which is to listen to his Son, because he is the only one who reconciles us with our Creator and brings his kingdom closer to our lives so that we can live in his will. And this was precisely what the disciples had to understand, and for this reason, it is why the Eternal tells them that he tells them that Yeshua is his Son, his beloved Son, and that they shall listen to everything that he was going to tell them. And that those words, we can understand that they were not only for his disciples, but also for us as believers, or us who call ourselves believers, who read these words, to not only read them, but also apply them to our life, to the importance for us to obey, to listen and obey to the words of Yeshua. So in that way we can reconcile Yeshua, who reconciles us with our Creator, and in that way we can live fulfilling the Eternal's will. Just like we can read in Peter, or just like Peter said in 2 Peter chapter 1 verses 16 to 18, that says, "For we do not follow clearly devised stories that we told you about the coming of our Yeshua the Messiah in power, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. He received honor and splendor from the Eternal, the Creator, or the Eternal Elohim, when the voice came to him from the majestic splendor, saying, 'This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased.'" Verse 18, "We ourselves heard this voice that came from heaven when we were with him on the sacred mountain." And in these verses, it is where Peter clarifies that, or clarifies this transfiguration of the Messiah, how he was there testifying everything that was, or seeing everything that was occurring with this transfiguration. Lastly, in this section of verses of the transfiguration of the Messiah, we can read that when the three disciples and Yeshua descended from this mountain, where the transfiguration took place, Yeshua tells them not to say a word of what they had witnessed until Yeshua resurrected. Because after the resurrection of the Messiah, everything would be known to the people in its due time. And which later on we're going to be reading that that's exactly what happened. We can also read that the disciples asked Yeshua about what the scribes had said, or what they were saying, that it was necessary for Elijah to come before the Messiah. And with this question that his disciples did, Yeshua answers to them that Elijah would indeed come before him, and that he had already come, which was John the Baptist, the one who had the spirit of Elijah. However, Yeshua does tell them that because of the blindness of these religious people, because of their hardened hearts, the people did not recognize the coming of Elijah in John the Baptist, because they did not like John the Baptist. And on the contrary, Yeshua does tell his disciples that they killed John the Baptist, and that John the Baptist basically suffered and was mistreated by the people. The Messiah also announces to them that he would also suffer in the same rejection, and disbelief on the part of the people, just like John the Baptist, had experienced or had gone through. But Yeshua does say that it would not be an impediment for him to carry out his tasks and bring the kingdom closer to the lives of those humble people who believe and obeyed the Yeshua the Messiah wholeheartedly. And well, this is what we can read from this transfiguration of the Messiah. From verses 14 to 29, we can also read about the healing of a child who was possessed by an unclean spirit. And in these verses, it starts narrating, or it begins by telling that a boy was brought to Yeshua who had a demon which the disciples had not been able to expel from this boy. And for this reason, or because of the fact that the disciples couldn't expel this demon, Yeshua tells his disciples that they are an unbelieving generation. And in this case of the disciples, it is a bit surprising that Yeshua calls them a generation or an unbelieving generation. Because or the reason why I'm saying this is because the disciples were men who not only followed Yeshua, but they were also with him to listen to his teachings. Although, yes, clearly, we can read and we have read that in some cases the disciples lacked in faith, they lacked in believing of what was happening, they doubted. But this is because in some occasions we can read that they lacked completely to completely trust in the eternal and in the authority that they had received through his son. And for this reason, it is probably why the disciples felt incapable or doubted in themselves in expelling this demon from this boy. So for this reason, it is why the Messiah exhorts his disciples to have full faith and to not doubt in themselves, but especially to not lack in faith. After, we can read that after this exhortation that Yeshua gives to his disciples, Yeshua ends up healing the boy quickly, which demonstrates which demonstrates what it means to have complete certainty, confidence, and security in the Father, to have true, complete faith in the Father. And this was something, once again, that the disciples were lacking on, but that later on we can read that the disciples ended up having full faith in the eternal. They ended up believing, and they did not doubt it in what they were called to do. Reading this situation, it gives us a lesson that as believers, we have the same instruction. That is, that we cannot doubt in the eternal. We cannot say that we're believers and not truly believe in the eternal and in what the eternal does. Nor we cannot also doubt the anointing that he has given us to fulfill his will and to help the other people. Always knowing that what we do and what we say does not depend on our strength or on our capacities or basically give us the credit, but rather it depends on the Father. Let's remember that we are guided, or if we say that we are true believers of the eternal and that we are true disciples of the Messiah, therefore we have the ruach of the eternal, which guides us in our life. So therefore, everything that we do, everything that we say must be done in maturity and overall in obedience towards our Father, always looking out to fulfill the will of our Father and always giving credit to our Father and not trying to give credit to ourselves. Taking the example of the Messiah, who throughout everything that he would do, miracles, teachings, liberations of unclean spirits, etc., Yeshua would always give all credit and always exalting the eternal and never giving himself the credit. So this is something that we can learn from this healing that Yeshua once again does for this child. From verses 30 to 32, it says, or we can read another case, which says, they left that place and passed through Galilee. Yeshua did not want anyone to know where they were, because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. Verse 32, but they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it. In these verses, we can read that Yeshua once again tells his disciples what would happen to him soon, how the Messiah would have to suffer and be put to death. This in order to fulfill his purpose or his calling, because in this way Yeshua would give himself as that perfect sacrifice or that perfect korban, and therefore every soul that wants to and wanted to, because this is an offer that continues till our days, can approach the eternal through the Messiah. So for this reason, it was necessary for Yeshua to go through all of this suffering and be put to death and then be resurrected by the eternal. Or we can also read in these verses that Yeshua tells the disciples that although he was going to be put to death or that he was going to die, he would still rise again on the third day. And this would be as a sign that his works had been pleasing before the eternal. And it was something that was going to clarify that Yeshua was the son of, or in other words, is the son of Elohim. This topic about the death and resurrection of the Messiah is something that we have already studied within the Good News and Matthew, and that we actually studied in the previous chapter 8 of Mark, and that we're studying in this chapter 9 of Mark. It is something that we have already studied, and in all of these occasions where Yeshua mentions about his death and resurrection, we can read that the disciples did not understand what Yeshua was telling them. We can even read that Peter refused to accept the delivery of the Messiah, but that later on the disciples ended up understanding. They ended up believing that Yeshua was the Messiah. They ended up understanding why Yeshua was telling them that and how everything had to be fulfilled. Like, it was something that had to be fulfilled, and it was not something that a disciple could have prevented. From verses 33 to 37, we can read that Yeshua's disciples were concerned about which of them were going to be the greatest in the kingdom. We can see that they had not yet fully understood what the kingdom was, and it seems that they retained the tradition belief that the kingdom of the Messiah would be an earthly reign like the one of David. This is why they wanted to have a prominent position. However, we do read that Yeshua's response goes directly to counteract that part of our human nature that seeks recognition. Yeshua does teach us that the life of a believer who wants to live in the kingdom is totally opposite to what the world pursues. But the Messiah within these verses says that the path of his disciples is another one, where we are called to be servants, to be those people who, instead of seeking to receive the exaltation of a man or of a person, they rather give themselves as a living sacrifice to the Father. The greatest in the kingdom is the one who humbles himself, the one who refuses to serve himself because his priority is to be known and approved overall by the Creator. And an example that we can take is the Messiah himself, because despite him being the first, despite him being the beloved Son, the one sent by the Eternal, he became a servant for all of us. He humbled himself and denied himself in order to fulfill the will of the Eternal. So we must take Yeshua's example and apply it to our lives to be those people who deny ourselves, who humble ourselves in order for us to fulfill the will of the Eternal. Never looking out for ourselves, but looking out on how to fulfill the will of the Eternal. And this is precisely what Yeshua wanted his disciples to understand, that we no longer live to please ourselves, but to obey the Father, to build the body of the Messiah as those living stones that help one another, putting into practice everything that the Messiah has taught us and that we can read within these good news or within these gospels, always being examples of obedience, integrity, and love for one's neighbors. And above all, doing it with humility. We know that there is no room for pride within the believers, just as the Messiah said that he who exalts himself will be humbled. We must be like children and fully believe without doubting, and they completely give themselves of what they believe. They are always willing to learn, to grow. And in these verses, it teaches us that we must imitate these characteristics that are those that the Eternal approves of, receiving his words and fulfilling them. In that way, it is how we can live in his kingdom of the Eternal and be considered as children of the Creator. From verses 38 to 47, it says, "Teacher," said John, "we saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he was not one of us." "Do not stop him," Yeshua said, "for no one who does a miracle in my name can in the next moment say anything bad about me." Verse 40, "For whoever is not against us is for us. Truly I tell you, anyone who gives you a cup of water in my name because you belong to the Messiah will certainly not lose their reward." In these verses, we can read that the main purpose of the words of Yeshua, or the words that Yeshua says, is that no one who does miracles in the name of Yeshua can later on speak badly about him, since the one who does miracles in Yeshua's name must obey, because otherwise it would be a contradiction of this person, or by a contradiction by the part of this person. Yeshua also teaches his disciples the importance of piety and helping others. This is important to always keep in mind, because out in the world, the people act in a selfish way, unjustful way, always being hypocrites, acting in evil ways, etc. And if we say that we are those true disciples of the Messiah, then we must act correctly, always giving fruits of obedience and justice, just as our Adon, or just as our Messiah did, and which we can take as an example. And also that we can take an example of other biblical characters who were considered tzaddik, or who were considered righteous people, who did acts, or who gave acts or fruits of obedience and justice, and who were found rightful in the eyes of the Eternal. So we must take these examples and do just as the Messiah says, to be those good testimony, to give that good testimony of, if we call ourselves to be disciples of the Messiah. Lastly, from verses 42 to 50, we can read that Yeshua warns of the severe judgment that would befall those who cause believers to stumble. The people who are a stumbling block are those who use the authority of the Messiah and his name to cause believers to fall, who twist the words of Yeshua, either adding more things to them or taking some things away from them. And the people who do this are people who want to gain benefits for themselves. This is something that the emissaries also warned the believers in Acts 20, verse 29 to 31, where basically they tell them on how there were going to be people who were going to be adding or taking away things from Yeshua's words, and how they had to be attentive to all of this so that they would not fall. It is clear that these people will receive the judgment of the Eternal for their wickedness and lies that they were doing. But as Paul said in Acts, that it is very important to be vigilant, because they decontextualized the scripture, and as the Messiah had also mentioned within these verses, that these are the doers of evil, who although they call Yeshua, although they call him Lord, but they are rebellious and disobey the Torah, and therefore they will not inherit the kingdom of heaven. In these words of the Messiah, it leaves us with a warning that everything in our life that makes us disobey the Eternal, we must cut it off radically. We must flee from the sins of the world, just as it says in 2 Timothy, chapter 2, verse 22, that says, "Flee the evil desires of youth and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Eternal out of a pure heart." To conclude with this chapter 9, we learned that we must be those living stones not carved by the hand of man, but by the word of the Eternal, which shape us to be part of the congregation of the Messiah. This transfiguration that we saw in the beginning of this chapter showed us that aspect of being found worthy to see the splendor of the kingdom of Elohim. As well, Yeshua showed his disciples what the true kingdom is like, which is spiritual, and that is why in the transfiguration he presented Moses and Elijah, who in their time represented the splendor of the Almighty before the people. We also saw this topic about a demonic boy, where we learned that the confidence of believing in the word is very important. We saw that the disciples were witnessing a very strong unclean spirit that not only implied obedience in the commandments, but also required prayer and fasting, which are spiritual sacrifices. And they are in intimate communion with the Father that we should not minimize, but strive to put into practice in our lives, especially as youth people. We also saw within this chapter 9 another aspect that we learned, that we must have, or that we must subject our body, spirit, and soul to be found worthy of presenting ourselves as sacrifices before our Creator, taking care that the flesh does not rule in us, but rather with full understanding, we let the Ruach be the one who directs us to fully believe as children in the kingdom of Elohim and in the words of Yeshua. And thus we will build ourselves as brothers to be living stones. And well, just as this chapter, or the title for this chapter is, the first in the kingdom believe and serve as living stones. Let us be those people who are first in the kingdom, serving as those living stones throughout our good fruits and throughout our lives, which have to be done in obedience and integrity towards our Creator. Always taking the example of the Messiah and of the disciples and apostles and other biblical people who are of great example for us. And well, this is all for today's video. Thank you very much for your time, and we will see each other in the next one. Bye.